There are places you return to in order to forget. You go back to the familiar architecture of your youth, the salt-scoured air of a town you once called home, believing that the sheer, repetitive weight of old memories will somehow press the new, sharper ones into a manageable shape, smoothing them out until they are just another layer of your past. I came back to this town on the edge of the world for that very reason, to let the rhythmic sigh of the ocean wash away the noise of a life that had become too loud, too demanding, too empty. I sought the anesthetic of nostalgia, but I had forgotten one crucial thing about coming home. Some places do not hold memories. People do. And he was here, a living archive of everything I had spent a decade trying to erase. Tonight, he was asleep on my couch. Liam. The name itself felt like a ghost on my tongue, a sound I had not dared to speak aloud in years. Yet here he was, a solid, breathing reality in the quiet dark of my small living room. The moonlight, filtered through the old, wavy glass of my windows, laid a pale blue sheet over him. It caught the sharp line of his jaw, the gentle curve of his lips, the faint, silvery tracks of old scars on his temple from a childhood fall I still remembered with a phantom ache in my own head. He was a landscape I had spent a lifetime memorizing, and seeing him again, so unguarded and close, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff I had sworn never to approach again. He had turned up on my doorstep 3 weeks ago, a shipwreck of a man, all his usual brilliant light dimmed to a flicker, and my carefully constructed fortress of solitude had crumbled into dust at the first sight of his exhausted face. He had murmured something about needing a place to stay, just for a little while, his voice rough with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. And I, the quiet observer, the chronicler of his life from the sidelines, had simply opened the door wider. There were no questions, no demands for explanation. The unspoken laws of our shared history dictated that my door was a port in his storm, and it had always been that way. But this was different. In the past, his storms were fleeting tempests, a bad breakup, a lost swim meet, a fight with his father. This felt like a change in the climate itself, a permanent lowering of the sky. He was adrift, and he had washed up on my shore. I stood there for what felt like an hour, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest beneath the thin t-shirt he wore. He had kicked off the blanket I'd given him, his long limbs sprawled in a way that spoke of a deep, dreamless sleep. One arm was flung over his head, the muscles of his shoulder and biceps still defined, but there was a new tension in them, a tightness even in rest. This was the shoulder that had failed him, the intricate mechanism of bone and sinew that had once propelled him through water with the grace of a seal, now a source of betrayal. It was the reason he was here, in my house, instead of in some chlorinated, brightly lit arena on the other side of the country, chasing the black line at the bottom of a pool. My camera was on the bookshelf, its lens a single, dark eye. The photographer in me, the part that had always used a piece of glass and machinery to safely mediate my distance from the world, screamed at me to capture this. The way the light carved his form out of the darkness, the profound vulnerability in his sleep, the story told in the weary set of his mouth. It would have been a beautiful shot, honest and raw, but I couldn't. To photograph him now felt like a violation, like stealing something he hadn't consciously offered. For all the years I had spent watching him, documenting him from afar, this felt too intimate, too close to the core of my own carefully guarded secret. Loving him from a distance was one thing. It was a quiet, manageable ache, a low hum beneath the surface of my life. But having him here, within reach, a warm and tangible presence filling the empty spaces of my home, was a different kind of pain altogether. It was a sharp, terrifying hope. I put my mug down on the counter, the ceramic making a soft click in the silence. I walked over to the couch, my bare feet silent on the worn wooden floorboards. I picked up the fallen blanket, a heavy wool thing my grandmother had made. Its familiar weight felt grounding in my hands. I hesitated, my fingers clenching in the fabric. This was the boundary. I could cover him, a simple act of friendship, of care, or I could let him be. Every choice, no matter how small, felt monumental. Every gesture was a word in a conversation we weren't having, a conversation I was terrified to start. I thought about the boy he had been, the man he had become, and the vast, silent ocean of my affection that lay between all those years. And with a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, I gently, carefully, draped the blanket over him, my knuckles brushing the warm skin of his arm. He stirred, a soft sigh escaping his lips, and settled deeper into the cushions, pulling the blanket closer. He didn't wake, and I was left standing in the moonlight, more alone and more connected to him than I had ever been in my life. The night was long, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that this was only the beginning. The reason he was on my couch began, as most of Liam's stories did, with water. He had lived his life in it, defined by it. For him, the world was divided into two states: the heavy, clumsy reality of land, and the weightless, silent grace of the pool. He was a competitive swimmer, a nationally ranked one. He was our town's golden boy, the one who got out, the one who was destined for magazine covers and podiums draped in flags. His entire existence was a metronome of workouts, qualifying times, and the relentless pursuit of shaving milliseconds off his personal best. His body was not just a body. It was a finely tuned instrument, a vessel of purpose. And then, one day, that instrument had broken. A torn rotator cuff, the surgeon had said. A common injury, but his was severe. The surgery was complex, the recovery uncertain. His career, the entire architecture of his identity, was suddenly suspended over an abyss of doubt. He hadn't called me. He'd just appeared. I was developing film in my makeshift darkroom in the back of the house, lost in the quiet alchemy of silver and light, when I heard the knock. It was a hesitant sound, not the confident, rhythmic rap Liam used to have. When I opened the door, the late afternoon sun was behind him, turning his familiar silhouette into a dark, anonymous shape. For a moment, my heart seized, thinking it was a stranger. Then he stepped forward, into the shade of the porch, and the world tilted on its axis. It was Liam, but a version of him I had never seen before. The easy, sun-bleached confidence was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out look in his eyes, a deep-seated weariness that seemed to pull at the corners of his mouth. He had a sling on his right arm, a stark white slash against his dark jacket. He looked smaller, somehow, less like the titan of my memories and more like a boy who had lost his way home. "Ethan," he'd said, and my name in his mouth was a sound both foreign and painfully familiar. "Liam, what are you doing here?" The question came out flatter than I intended, my shock smoothing all the emotion out of my voice. He'd offered a weak, lopsided smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thought I'd come back. See the ocean." It was a deflection, a flimsy excuse we both recognized. Liam never just came back. He visited on prescribed holidays, a bright, transient star passing through his old orbit before heading back to his real life. He didn't come back to see the ocean. He came back because he was drowning on dry land, and this was the only place he knew to find a lifeline. He asked if he could stay for a bit, just until he figured things out. The phrase hung in the air between us, heavy with all the things it was trying to hide. I didn't need to know the details of the injury, the failed rehab, the scholarships that were now in jeopardy. I could see it all in the slump of his good shoulder, in the way he avoided my gaze, looking past me into the cool darkness of my house, as if it were a sanctuary. And so he moved in, not into the spare room. He'd refused, saying the couch was fine, that he didn't want to be a bother, but into the center of my quiet, ordered life. His presence was a disruption, a vibrant, chaotic energy introduced into my muted world. His duffel bag lay perpetually half unpacked by the door. His scent, a mix of the soap I used and something uniquely him, like clean laundry and distant rain, began to permeate the house. He was a ghost haunting the daylight hours, restless and adrift. He'd wander the town, walking for miles along the coastline, and return at dusk, salt-crusted and silent, sinking into the cushions of my couch as if his own bones were too heavy to hold him upright. His vibrant, kinetic energy had been grounded, and he didn't know what to do with a body that could no longer do the one thing it was built for. We didn't talk about it. Not really. The injury was a sleeping giant in the room, and we both tiptoed around it. I would ask him how his physical therapy went, and he would give one-word answers. Fine, okay, tiring. He would ask what I was working on, and I would show him my latest photographs of the shifting dunes or the gnarled, wind-beaten cypress trees that lined the shore. Our conversations were small islands in a vast sea of silence, but it was a comfortable silence, one forged in the crucible of a shared childhood. We had always been able to exist in the same space without the need for constant noise. But this silence was different. It was heavier, freighted with his pain and my unspoken, overwhelming empathy. I was watching the brightest person I had ever known learn to live with his light turned down, and it was breaking my heart in slow, silent increments. His need for comfort was a raw, open thing, and he had come to me to find it. I just hadn't realized yet that in his search for solace, he was going to dismantle every wall I had ever built around my own heart. To understand the weight of him sleeping on my couch, you have to understand the geography of our friendship. We grew up in this town like two different species of plant in the same small garden, our roots intertwined, but our natures entirely distinct. Liam was a sunflower, heliotropic, always turning toward the light, drawing all eyes to him. He was motion and sound, the laughter at the center of every group, the splash in the community pool, the hero of every local sports page headline. He was built of sunshine and chlorine, his hair always damp, his skin smelling of summer. Everyone loved Liam. It was a fundamental, undisputed truth of our town, like the tide coming in or the gulls crying at dawn. I was more like the moss that grew in the shade of the old sea wall, quiet, observant, and easily overlooked. My world was framed by the viewfinder of a camera. While Liam was living life in bold, primary colors, I was trying to capture it in shades of gray, to find the story in the shadows, in the moments between the action. I didn't document our town, I documented him. I have boxes of negatives, thousands of frames, that are a secret history of Liam's boyhood. Liam, a blur of motion diving off the highboard. Liam, laughing with his head thrown back on the beach, the setting sun turning his silhouette to gold. Liam, looking thoughtful and distant on the pier, staring out at a horizon I could never quite see. He was my unwitting and only muse. He knew I took pictures, of course. He'd pose for me sometimes, striking ridiculous, heroic stances, and then collapsing into laughter. He thought it was just my hobby, my quirky Ethan thing. He never understood that it wasn't a hobby, it was a language. It was the only way I knew how to say what I couldn't speak. I had loved him since we were 16. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic realization. It was a slow, quiet sunrise, a dawning awareness that began one autumn afternoon. We were sitting on the bleachers overlooking the empty football field, the air crisp with the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves. He was talking about a girl, a cheerleader named Sarah, and as he described her smile, the way her hair caught the light, I felt a strange, cold hollowness in my chest. It wasn't jealousy of Sarah, it was a profound, aching envy of his ability to feel that way, and a dawning, terrifying recognition that the way he was describing her was how I felt when I looked at him. The realization didn't change anything on the surface. I buried it deep, packing it down like soil over a seed I never intended to let grow. It was an impossible, ridiculous notion. Liam was Liam, a creature of sunlight and easy affection for girls with bright smiles. I was me, his quiet, constant friend in the background. Our orbits were fixed. To try and change them would be to invite catastrophe, to risk the destruction of the single, most important relationship in my life. So I watched. I watched him date a succession of lovely, interchangeable girls. I listened to him talk about his dreams of the Olympics. I celebrated his victories and offered silent comfort for his rare defeats. I became an expert in the art of platonic intimacy, learning the precise calibration of how long a friendly hug could last, the exact distance to stand so it was close, but not too close, the right tone of voice to convey affection without revealing adoration. I built a fortress of friendship around my heart, and for more than a decade, it had held. I went away to college, studied photography, and build a life for myself, a quiet one, always with Liam as a distant, cherished presence. We'd talk on the phone, exchange texts, see each other on holidays. The distance was a blessing. It made the ache manageable. But coming back here, to this small town where every street corner held a memory of him, was a mistake. I had thought the ghosts were in the place, but they were in me. And then he had shown up, not as a memory or a voice on the phone, but as a warm, breathing man in crisis, and he had walked straight through the gates of my fortress without even realizing they were there. He came to me because I was safe. I was the one person who had never asked anything of him, who had always just been there. The irony was a blade twisting in my gut. The very thing that made me his safe harbor, my silent, unrequited love, was the thing that made having him here so profoundly dangerous for me. He was seeking refuge in the one place that was most vulnerable to the storm he brought with him. The ritual began subtly, an unspoken agreement that solidified over the first week. He would come back in the evenings, physically and emotionally drained from his physical therapy sessions, and collapse onto the couch. I'd be in the kitchen making dinner, and I'd just make enough for two without asking. We'd eat, sometimes talking, sometimes in that comfortable silence, and then migrate back to the living room. I'd put on a movie, usually some old black and white classic I loved, something slow and quiet that wouldn't demand too much of him. He'd stretch out on the couch, his head propped up on a cushion, and within 20 minutes, he'd be asleep. The first few times, I would gently wake him when the movie was over, telling him he should go to a real bed. He'd just mumble something, his voice thick with sleep, and burrow deeper into the cushions. After a while, I stopped trying. I would just turn off the television, leaving a single small lamp on, and leave him be. I'd go to my own bed, lie in the dark, and listen to the sound of his soft, even breathing from the other room. It was a strange kind of domesticity, a pantomime of a life I had only ever allowed myself to imagine in the brief, unguarded moments before sleep. My house was small, a little two-bedroom bungalow I'd inherited from my grandparents. The walls were thin. Every sigh, every rustle of fabric, every time he shifted his weight on the old, creaky springs of the couch, was an intimate broadcast into the silence of my room. I became a connoisseur of the sounds of Liam sleeping. I could distinguish the shallow breathing of a light doze from the deep, slow rhythm of profound exhaustion. I learned the sound of the soft grunt he made when a dream shifted, the whisper of his bare feet on the floorboards if he got up in the middle of the night for a glass of water. My home, once my solitary sanctuary, was now a shared space, every square inch of it charged with his presence. I felt like I was living inside a photograph I was still developing, the image slowly emerging, beautiful and terrifying, and I had no idea what the final picture would look like. Then, the ritual escalated. It was a Tuesday night, about 2 weeks into his stay. A cold front had moved in, bringing a damp, chilling rain that rattled against the windows. He came back from his walk looking pale and drawn, shivering slightly. He complained that his shoulder was aching, a deep, throbbing pain the cold had woken up. That night, as he lay on the couch, I could see he wasn't comfortable. He kept shifting, trying to find a position that didn't put pressure on the joint, his face tight with pain even in sleep. I watched him for a long time, my own shoulders aching in sympathy. The sight of him in pain was a physical thing for me, a sharp pang behind my ribs. The next morning, he looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes. He was quiet at breakfast, stirring his coffee with a listless slowness. "You didn't sleep well?" I stated, not a question. He shook his head, wincing as he moved his arm. "This couch is killing my back. And my shoulder." He looked up at me, his gaze direct and apologetic. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I'm being a terrible guest. Don't be ridiculous," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You're not a guest, Liam. You're you." I took a breath, forcing my tone to soften. "Take my bed. I'll sleep on the couch." "It's no big deal. No, I can't do that. I can't kick you out of your own bed. It's fine. I can sleep anywhere." It was a lie. I was a terrible sleeper, prone to restlessness and bouts of insomnia. But it was a lie I would have gladly lived with to give him a night of comfort. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee mug as if it held the answer to some complex equation. Then he looked up, a hesitant, almost shy expression on his face. It was a look I'd never seen on him before, and it made my heart beat a little faster. What if we both took it?" he asked, his voice low. "It's a big bed, right? Queen size? We could just share. It'd be warmer, and I could prop my shoulder up with pillows properly. We used to have sleepovers all the time when we were kids." The air left my lungs in a silent rush. He said it so casually, invoking our shared childhood as a shield of innocence, a perfectly reasonable, platonic solution to a practical problem. For him, it probably was just that, a practical solution. For me, it was a cataclysm. It was every secret, half-formed fantasy I'd ever had stepping out of the shadows and into the stark light of reality. My mind raced, searching for an excuse, a reason to say no, a way to protect myself from the exquisite torture of what he was proposing. But I couldn't find one that wouldn't sound insane. "No, you can't sleep in my bed because I'm desperately in love with you, and lying next to you all night will probably make my heart explode." It wasn't an option. So I heard myself say, in a voice that sounded remarkably calm, "Okay, yeah, that makes sense." That night, the ritual changed. After the movie, I didn't go to my room alone. I went in, and a few minutes later, he followed. The space, which had always felt like my own, suddenly felt charged, every object imbued with a new significance. The book on my nightstand, the worn patch on my quilt, the way the streetlight cast a pattern on the wall, it was all now part of a shared scene. I got into bed first, staying rigidly on my side, my back to the center. I heard him moving around in the dim light, the soft sounds of him brushing his teeth in the adjoining bathroom, the rustle of him changing out of his jeans and into a pair of sweatpants. He turned off the light, and the room was plunged into a soft darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow from the window. I felt the mattress dip as he got in beside me. The space between us felt both as wide as an ocean and as thin as a sheet of paper. He lay on his back, his injured arm propped carefully on a pillow. I lay on my side, facing away from him, my whole body a single, tense line. I was hyper-aware of everything. The warmth radiating from his body, so close to my back. The scent of my toothpaste on his breath. The sound of his breathing, deeper and closer than it had ever been from the other room. I could feel the minute vibrations through the mattress each time he shifted his weight. It was an agony of proximity. I lay there for what felt like years, my eyes wide open in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was willing myself to be calm, to breathe normally, to just fall asleep. Then, his voice, a low murmur in the dark, made me jump. "Ethan." "Yeah." My voice was a croak. I cleared my throat. "Yeah. Thanks. For this. For everything. It's nothing." I whispered back to the wall. "No, it's not." There was a pause. "It's everything." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. A few minutes later, his breathing evened out, deepening into the familiar rhythm of sleep. He was asleep, and I was wide awake, lying next to him in the dark, caught in a beautiful, impossible dream I was terrified I would never wake up from. This became our new normal. Every night, we would retreat to the same bed. The initial, screaming tension in my own body slowly subsided, replaced by a low, constant hum of awareness. I learned the topography of his sleeping form, the way he would sometimes turn in his sleep and his hand would brush against my back, or his knee would touch mine. Each accidental point of contact was a small electric shock that would jolt me from the edge of sleep. He seemed to be healing, not just physically, but emotionally. The deep-seated weariness in his eyes began to recede. He started to smile more, real smiles that reached his eyes. He talked more, not about the future, but about the past, about our shared memories. We fell back into the easy rhythm of our old friendship, but it was underpinned by this new, profound, and deeply confusing intimacy. We were friends who shared a bed. We were friends who lived together in a quiet, domestic tableau. We were two men existing in a space that had no name, no definition. And the ambiguity was hollowing me out. I was living on a knife's edge of hope and fear. Every gesture, every look, Every word was something I would take apart and analyze for hours in the solitude of my darkroom. Was his hand lingering on my shoulder for a moment too long a sign, or just a friendly touch? Was the way he looked at me across the dinner table just affection, or was there something deeper in his gaze? I was lost in a fog of interpretation, and I was terrified that if the fog ever cleared, I would find I had been navigating by stars that were never really there. One night, he fell asleep while I was reading, his head on his pillow, turned towards me. I watched him in the soft glow of my bedside lamp. In sleep, the guardedness fell away from his face. He looked younger, more like the boy I had grown up with. An errant strand of his dark hair had fallen across his forehead, and without thinking, my body moving before my brain could issue a veto, I reached out and gently brushed it back. My fingers grazed the skin of his temple. It was warm, soft. It was the first time I had touched him intentionally, not by accident, in years. A jolt went through me, a powerful current of longing and terror. He didn't stir. I pulled my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove, my heart pounding. I quickly turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness, as if the dark could hide the enormity of what I had just done, of what I felt. Lying there, my hand still tingling, I knew this couldn't last. The fragile structure of our arrangement was beginning to fracture under the weight of everything I was keeping inside. Something had to break. The breaking point arrived on a Saturday night in late October. The day had been unseasonably warm, a last, golden gift from autumn before the long, gray slide into winter. We had spent the afternoon walking the beach, not talking much, just enjoying the week's sunshine and the sound of the waves. There was a lightness to Liam that I hadn't seen since he'd arrived. He'd had a good report from his physical therapist. The range of motion in his shoulder was improving faster than expected. For the first time, there was a flicker of the old, optimistic Liam, a glimpse of the man who believed in his own body's ability to overcome anything. The hope, however fragile, was palpable, and it made the air between us feel different, less heavy. That night, we didn't watch a movie. We sat in the living room and listened to music, an old vinyl record of a folk singer I loved, the crackle and pop of the needle a comforting, nostalgic sound. We shared a bottle of wine, something I rarely did, but the day had felt like a small celebration. The alcohol and the music and the warm, quiet atmosphere of the room conspired to lower my defenses. The constant, vigilant guard I kept on my own heart was drowsy, inattentive. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. About people we used to know, about stupid things we did as kids, about the way the town had changed and the ways it had stubbornly stayed the same. It was easy. It was perfect. And it was dangerous. When we finally went to bed, the usual tension was absent, replaced by a soft, warm languor. We lay in our usual positions, on our separate sides of the bed, the familiar space between us. But tonight, the silence wasn't empty. It was full, humming with the energy of the evening, with unspoken thoughts and feelings that felt closer to the surface than ever before. I was on my side, facing away from him, but I was acutely aware that he hadn't fallen asleep. I could feel his wakefulness, his stillness. The air in the room grew thick, charged. It felt like the moment before a storm breaks, the air heavy and electric. After a long time, his voice came out of the darkness, quiet and tentative, barely a whisper. "Ethan." I didn't turn over. I couldn't. My heart had started a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. "Yeah." There was a long pause, so long I thought maybe he had drifted off to sleep, that I had imagined him speaking. Then, he spoke again, his voice even quieter, laced with a vulnerability that I had never heard from him in all the years I had known him. "Can I ask you something stupid?" I finally found the breath to answer, my own voice a strained whisper. Always, I could hear the soft sound of him shifting, turning onto his side to face my back. I could feel the warmth of his body closer now, feel the faint stir of his breath against my neck. Every nerve in my body was on fire. I was suspended in that moment, in the space between his question and his question. It felt like a lifetime. "Would it be okay?" he began, and his voice hitched, just for a second, a tiny crack in his composure. He took a breath and started again. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The sound of the ocean outside, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the beating of my own heart. It all went silent. His question hung in the air, a fragile, impossible thing. It wasn't a proposition, not a move. It was a plea. It was a confession of a feeling he likely didn't even have a name for yet. It was him, standing on the edge of a cliff, asking me if it was safe to jump. And in that moment, all my fear, all my carefully constructed walls, all my years of silent longing, they all dissolved into one single, simple truth. I turned over slowly, the sheets whispering as I moved. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, I could just make out his face, his eyes wide and searching in the dark. He was so close. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my lips. My own fear was gone, replaced by a profound, overwhelming tenderness for this beautiful, broken man who had sought refuge in my home and had somehow, impossibly, found his way to the very center of my heart. I didn't need words. I just nodded, a small, barely perceptible movement. But he saw it, and then he was leaning in, slowly, tentatively, giving me every possible chance to turn away. I didn't. I met him halfway. His lips were soft, hesitant. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a discovery. It was quiet and gentle, and it felt more like coming home than the town itself ever had. It lasted only a few seconds, but it redrew the map of my entire world. When he pulled back, he didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, and we just breathed together in the dark, the space between us finally, blessedly, gone. The silence that returned was different. It was not empty, and it was not heavy. It was a silence of reverence, of two people standing on the other side of a door they had just walked through together, into a room they had never been in before. The morning after was a study in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one that had followed the kiss. That night, the quiet had been a shared, sacred space. This morning, it was a wall of glass between us, invisible but solid. I woke up first, just as the sun was beginning to bleed gray light into the sky. Liam was still asleep, but he had moved in the night. He was on his side, facing me, his arm thrown across my waist, his face buried in my shoulder. He was holding on to me as if I were a raft in a storm. For a few precious, unguarded moments, I let myself believe. I lay perfectly still, memorizing the weight of his arm, the feeling of his breath against my skin, the simple, profound fact of his closeness. I allowed myself a flicker of impossible hope. But then he started to stir, and the hope was quickly extinguished by a familiar, creeping anxiety. He mumbled something in his sleep and shifted, his eyes fluttering open. For a second, they were unfocused, soft with sleep. Then they focused on me, and recognition dawned. And with it came a sudden, sharp panic. I saw it clear as day. He went rigid, his whole body tensing. He pulled his arm back as if he'd been burned, scrambling away from me until his back was pressed against the far edge of the mattress. The space he created between us felt like a chasm. He started, his voice a rough croak. He didn't look at me. He was staring at the wall, at the ceiling, anywhere but at my face. I have an early PT appointment. It was a clumsy, transparent lie. His appointments were always in the afternoon. But I didn't call him on it. I couldn't speak. A cold, heavy dread was spreading through my chest, hardening into something that felt like grief. I just watched as he threw back the covers and practically leaped out of bed. He grabbed his clothes from the floor and disappeared into the bathroom without another word, closing the door with a soft, definitive click. The sound echoed in the silent room. I lay there, staring at the closed door, the space where he had been beside me already growing cold. The warmth, the connection, the fragile hope of the night before, it had all been a dream. The sun was coming up, and in the harsh light of day, reality had returned. He was gone before I even got out of bed. I heard the front door open and close, and the silence he left behind was immense, cavernous. It was worse than the solitude I had curated for myself before he arrived. This was an absence, a void where something had briefly, miraculously, existed. I spent the day in a fog of hurt and confusion. I went to my darkroom, the one place I could always find clarity, but the familiar process brought no comfort. The images emerging in the chemical baths seemed to mock me, their stark black and whiter reflection of my own simplistic, foolish hope. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have misinterpreted everything so completely? He was in pain, adrift, and confused. He had reached out for comfort, for the closest, safest thing he could find. And that was me. I was a port in a storm, a temporary anchor. The kiss hadn't been a confession. It had been an aberration, a moment of weakness, a symptom of his own turmoil that had nothing to do with me. Not really. I had been a convenience, a warm body in a cold and frightening time. The thought was a shard of ice in my heart. The pain of my unrequited love had always been a dull, chronic ache. This was new. This was a sharp, acute agony. It was the pain of having something you never thought you could have, only to have it snatched away, leaving you with the ghost of its touch and the bitter taste of its loss. He didn't come back that night. A text message appeared on my phone around 10 o'clock. Crashing at a friend's place. Sorry. Need some space, a friend's place. The words were a casual cruelty. I was his friend. I was the friend whose bed he had been sharing for weeks. Now I was relegated to something else, something he needed space from. The next day was the same. And the day after that. The silence stretched into a tense, unbearable standoff. His duffel bag was still by my door, a constant, taunting reminder of his presence and his absence. After 3 days of this agonizing silence, something inside me shifted. The hurt was still there, a massive, bruising weight. But underneath it, a slow, quiet anger began to burn. It wasn't anger at him for not returning my feelings. I had never expected him to. It was anger at his cowardice. It was anger at being made to feel like a mistake, a shameful secret. Whatever had happened between us, whatever it meant or didn't mean, I deserved more than a ghosting. Our friendship, the decades of history that bound us together, deserved more than a clipped text message and a silent retreat. The quiet observer had had enough of watching from the sidelines. I knew where he would be. There was only one place in this town he always went when he needed to think, when the world became too much. The old pier at the north end of the beach. It was a skeletal structure, long since condemned, its timbers bleached silver by the sun and salt. We had spent countless hours there as kids, fishing for crabs, daring each other to walk to the crumbling end. It was our place. I found him standing at the very edge, staring out at the gray, churning water of the Atlantic. The wind was fierce, whipping his hair around his face and pulling at his jacket. He didn't hear me approach over the roar of the surf. I stood a few feet behind him, my own jacket zipped up to my chin against the cold. "Liam," I said. My voice was steady, carried away by the wind. He flinched, his whole body going rigid. He turned slowly, his face a mask of conflict. There was surprise, guilt, and a deep, profound sadness in his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "What do you want, Ethan?" he asked, his voice rough. "I want you to talk to me," I said, taking a step closer. The wind tried to tear the words from my mouth, but I held my ground. "I want you to stop hiding. Whatever that was the other night, whatever you're feeling, you don't get to just disappear. You don't get to treat me like I'm some dirty secret you're ashamed of." My voice was rising, fueled by days of pent-up pain and frustration. "I deserve more than that. We deserve more than that." He looked away, back at the tumultuous ocean. "You don't understand? Then make me understand," I shouted, the sound raw and desperate. "Talk to me, Liam. For God's sake, just be honest. If it was a mistake, just say it. If you regret it, tell me. I can take it. But what I can't take is this silence. This cowardice. It's not who you are that got through to him." He winced as if I'd struck him. He turned back to me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, his jaw tight. "A mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "You think that's what I'm afraid of? That it was a mistake?" He let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "God, Ethan, I'm not afraid it was a mistake." He took a ragged breath, the wind stealing it away. "I'm terrified that it wasn't. The confession, when it finally came, was not a gentle unfolding. It was a dam breaking. We stood on that windswept pier, the gray sky pressing down and the sea churning below, and he let it all out. The words tumbled from him in a rush of fear and confusion, raw and unfiltered. He wasn't looking at me, but at some distant point on the horizon, as if he were confessing to the ocean itself. He spoke of the crushing weight of his injury, the loss of his identity. He said that for months he'd felt like he was floating in a cold, dark void, untethered from everything he had ever known or been. His life, once a straight, black line at the bottom of a pool, had become a chaotic, directionless drift. "And then I came here," he said, his voice low and hoarse against the wind. "I came to your house, and it was quiet. It was solid. You were solid. Being with you, in your quiet little world, it was the first time in months that I felt like I was on solid ground. The first time I felt safe." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. I didn't know what it was. I just knew I needed it. I needed to be near you. It was like I was cold, and you were the only source of warmth in the whole world. He paced the weathered planks of the pier, his good hand shoved deep into his pocket, the other, in its now absent sling, hanging limply at his side. "Sharing your bed, it started as a practical thing, I swear. My shoulder hurt, the couch was awful. But then, it wasn't practical anymore. Lying there at night, just listening to you breathe, it was the only time my own head would go quiet. The only time the panic would stop screaming at me." He stopped pacing and faced me, his expression etched with a painful honesty. "I started to need it. I started to need you. And I didn't understand why my own anger had evaporated, replaced by a vast, aching empathy. I just listened, letting him fill the space between us with his truth. That night," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "when I kissed you, it wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing I've done in a year. It felt right. It felt like something I'd been searching for without even knowing I was looking." He shook his head, a look of profound self-bewilderment on his face. "And that's what scared the hell out of me. Because it didn't fit. It didn't fit with anything I thought I knew about myself. I'm Liam, the swimmer, the guy who dates girls, the guy who has his whole life mapped out. And suddenly, none of that was true anymore. The map was gone. And the only compass point that felt real was you." He finally ran out of words, his chest heaving with the effort of it all. He looked exhausted, stripped bare. He had laid all his fear and confusion at my feet, and now he was just waiting, braced for my judgment, for my rejection. I closed the distance between us, stepping into his space until we were only a foot apart. The wind whipped strands of my hair across my face, but I didn't care. I looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time, I let him see everything. All the years of silent affection, all the patient waiting, all the fear, and all the hope. I let him see it all. "You idiot," I said, and my voice was soft, impossibly tender. "You absolute, beautiful idiot." A tear finally escaped his eye and tracked a path through the salt spray on his cheek. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry I ran. I didn't know how to be this person. This version of me, you don't have to know," I said, and I reached out, my hand hesitant for only a second before I gently cupped his jaw, my thumb stroking his cheek. His skin was cold from the wind. He leaned into my touch, a shuddering sigh escaping him as his eyes fluttered shut. "We can figure it out. Together. You don't have to have a map, Liam. We can just walk. See where the path goes." He opened his eyes, and the fear was gone, replaced by a fragile, dawning hope. "Yeah," he whispered. "Yeah," I confirmed. "But no more running away. No more silence. You talk to me, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared." He nodded, a slow, solemn movement. And then, he leaned in and kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation, no questioning. It was a kiss of relief, of homecoming. It was firm and sure and tasted of salt and rain and the promise of a new beginning. We stood there on that crumbling pier, two lost boys in a town built on memories, and for the first time, we were creating a new one that belonged only to us. We walked back from the pier in a comfortable, charged silence. The argument had cleared the air, leaving behind a clean, quiet space for something new to grow. When we reached my house, the little bungalow looked different, more like a home than it ever had before. Liam paused on the doorstep, looking at his duffel bag, which still sat by the door like an abandoned piece of luggage. He looked at it. Then he looked at me, a question in his eyes. I just smiled and opened the door wider. He picked up the bag, stepped inside, and this time, he took it with him into the spare bedroom. He didn't say anything, but the gesture was clear. He wasn't a temporary guest on my couch anymore. He was staying. The days that followed were a process of gentle recalibration. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. The ambiguity that had been a source of so much anxiety was gone, replaced by a quiet intentionality. We talked. We talked for hours, filling in the silent spaces that had existed between us for years. I told him about my long-held feelings, not as a confession demanding a response, but as a piece of history, a part of the foundation upon which we were now building. He listened, his expression a mixture of awe and regret, and he apologized for his own blindness, for all the years he had looked at me but had never truly seen me. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was open, honest, and free from the weight of unspoken questions. When we shared the bed, there was no rigid adherence to our own sides. We would drift together in sleep, our limbs tangling, seeking warmth and comfort without thought or hesitation. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night to find his arm around me, his head resting on my shoulder, and the feeling was no longer one of terrifying hope, but of a deep, abiding peace. It felt right. It felt like coming home. He started to heal, in every sense of the word. His shoulder grew stronger, the pain receding. But more importantly, the light came back into his eyes. He started to laugh again, that full-throated, uninhibited laugh that I had missed more than I had realized. He was rediscovering himself outside the confines of the pool. He found a job helping coach the local high school swim team, and he was brilliant at it. He had a patience and an empathy for the kids that was beautiful to watch. He was finding a new purpose, a new way to love the water that had once been the source of his identity and his pain. My life changed too. My solitary world opened up to include him. My darkroom, once my private sanctuary, became a shared space. He'd sit with me in the dim, red light, watching in fascination as I worked, asking questions about the process. He'd watch the images of his own past emerge in the developer tray, photos of a younger, sun-kissed boy he barely recognized, and he would smile, a soft, nostalgic expression on his face. He was seeing himself through my eyes for the first time. One afternoon, I was setting up my large-format camera on the beach, preparing to take a long exposure shot of the tide coming in. It was a slow, meditative process, requiring patience and precision. Liam was with me, sitting on a piece of driftwood, just watching. He wasn't restless or bored. He was just present. After I had everything set up and had opened the shutter, I went and sat next to him. We watched the waves roll in, a steady, rhythmic pulse. Without a word, he reached over and took my hand. His fingers laced with mine, his hand warm and strong around my own. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. We had held hands as children 1,000 times. But this was different. This was a quiet declaration, made to the sky and the sea and to no one else. This was us. We sat like that for a long time, until the light began to fail and I had to close the shutter. We walked home, hand in hand, as the sky turned a bruised purple and the first stars began to appear. Back at the house, I made coffee while he put on that same old folk record, the one we had listened to on the night of the first kiss. The familiar, crackling notes filled the warm kitchen. He came up behind me as I was pouring the coffee, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. I leaned back against him, his solid warmth a comforting weight. We stood there for a long moment, just swaying gently to the music. I came back to this town to forget a life that no longer fit me, to retreat into the quiet solitude of my past. I came here seeking an ending, but instead, I found him. Or perhaps, we found each other. He remembered everything I was trying to erase, not as a source of pain, but as the shared history that had, against all odds, led us to this exact moment. He was no longer just the unwitting muse in my photographs. He was the man standing beside me, helping me build a new life. We had started in a house full of unspoken things, of hesitant gestures and fearful silences. But slowly, carefully, we had built something new. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest quiet we had learned to create together. It wasn't a silence of absence or fear, but a silence full of understanding, of peace, of a love that had finally, after all these years, found its voice.